Alrighty, so we are almost done with First Peter here. We're in chapter 5. Depending on how things go, I don't think we'll probably finish today, but we'll be pretty darn close.
So you're saying there's a chance?
Right. I guess we'll see how that goes. But
8 verses in one sitting.
yeah, it'll be I don't think we've gone through 8 verses at all in a single night yet.
Maybe at the very beginning.
Maybe.
I think like the first week we might have, but
We went through 6 or 7 one of the weeks that David wasn't here.
that's how that works. My bad, guys.
But yeah, we're definitely on the tail end of the letter, and so I guess really just before we hop into what we have to talk about tonight, just doing I guess it doesn't really have to be a quick recap, but we'll just do another recap like we always do of what we've really been talking about throughout this letter. So obviously we've been talking about 1 Peter, this letter that's written by the Apostle Peter, one of the, if not the chief apostle that followed Jesus, and he is writing to a general audience of most likely Jewish Christians, but nevertheless they are described as chosen exiles of the diaspora of modern day Turkey, and these people seem to be facing some sort of opposition. We don't know what the opposition is, but we've been wrestling through really how Peter has been telling these people how to handle this opposition, both by what they should and should not do. Regardless of how others act towards his audience, nevertheless, what's most important is how they react, and the same is for us as well. What are some different things that Peter has been emphasizing that his audience, or really us as Christians, that what we should and should not do when we face opposition, whether from other Christians or from unbelieving people?
One of the main things is not to lash out.
Mm-hmm. And why exactly are we not? I mean, aside from maybe some more obvious reasons, but really we've explored quite a few reasons as to why that is.
one of them was the example that Christ gave us. He didn't lash out, and we're supposed to follow in his footsteps.
That's true. Another example another reason is that the Gentiles are watching, and we are called to have good conduct among the Gentiles, because really the way that we respond to opposition does say a lot about our testimony. This is a lot more than what we preach and what we say we believe. People do tend to compare the two and see how we line up with what we say.
As they should.
As they should.
Yeah. A lot of Christians will get upset by that. They'll be like, just listen to what I'm saying, not what I'm doing. It's like, no. That's what Jesus said why he said to not listen to the Pharisees. Because Pharisees preached one thing and lived another.
That's true. Yeah, you shouldn't have to worry about it either. If you're living in line with what you're believing. What else? Because there were other things we talked about too. Why is it important? It's not a matter of salvation, but why else would it be important that we don't lash out and retaliate?
Because we're just giving into our sinful desires, right? Because we're just responding as the world responds, and if we're responding how the world responds, then what did Christ die for? If we're just gonna keep being slaves to the same sins that we were slaves to before, then what makes us distinct? We're just still doing things the same way that people were prior to receiving the Spirit.
Yeah, a big emphasis has been on the idea that, or not even the idea, but the fact that through Christ's resurrection, we've been born again unto a new life, and with that comes living a holy life. Living holy just as the one that we call Father is holy, and so that's for sure one part. Another thing too is just simply the fact that Peter seems to outline, in one sense, it's not the only way, but he outlines faith as also believing and trusting that God is just, and that all of the injustices, all of the wrongs, all the evils in the world, they're going to be brought to justice in the end. And so in feeling the need to lash out and retaliate shows a lack of faith in God as the ultimate judge and vindicator of sorts. And so it actually kind of exposes our faith a little bit too. Because it's one thing to say that you believe that, but in your actions, do you show that you actually trust that God is just?
Yeah, that's a big aspect that I think sometimes we do get wrong in our churches, where we focus a lot more on like doctrinal correctness, which is good. We need to be doctrinally sound. But a lot of times we think, oh, well, as long as somebody recites the right creed, we know they're a Christian. Whereas in reality, it's not theology that saves you, it's faith that saves you. And faith is demonstrated through your actions. And so really, how you handle hardship is going to be a testimony about your faith, right? Like if you respond differently than the world, that is going to demonstrate where your faith actually relies, right? Whereas there's a lot of people who can recite a creed. That doesn't mean that they have faith, right? It simply means that they were taught by somebody who probably had faith. Or they were taught by somebody who had been taught by somebody who actually had faith. Or they were taught by somebody who had been taught by somebody who taught, it just means that they received the tradition, right? Where sometimes that's all we focus on.
Mm-hmm. And in some cases, they might, it probably wouldn't be wrong to say that those people probably think they have faith, but it did take that hardship to reveal that to them, that their faith was not as strong as they thought. And we kind of discussed this too, because, Peter might be one of the best examples of this. Not necessarily specifically with the faith in God being just in the end, but in general, just being faithful. We saw that in the Gospels, the accounts where Peter denied Jesus pretty shortly after he said he would never do that. Clearly he thought he had faith until he actually faced certain hardships, certain opposition, and then he had to kind of face the reality and the humility of realizing that he wasn't as strong as he thought. And so I think that we've also talked a little bit about how actually necessary trials and hardship can be to strengthen our faith, because we may not realize where we're at until those things happen. Like we talked about in just the first chapter, the testing of your faith is more precious than gold. The imagery there is of gold being refined, but gold eventually perishes, whereas when our faith is tested and our faith gets stronger, we aren't going to perish, because we are going to be resurrected and glorified. But before that is going to come humility and suffering, and then later exaltation. And that's been a big theme, right? Is suffering now and glory later.
Ties into what we're going to be talking about tomorrow night at church Wednesday. Just an FYI and kind of a shameless plug in case y'all want to show up.
Sneak peek.
Yeah, John chapter 16. Grief into glory.
Heck yeah.
That's all I have to say. Sorry, I wasn't.
No, you're good.
With that.
But another thing we did talk about is the importance of keeping the end goal in mind to kind of keep you sober-minded, because a big thing has been keeping a sober mind and praying and a lot of that's hard to do if you don't, keep the fact, like, if you don't keep, the future hope of glory, in mind. If you don't keep heaven in mind. If your eyes are on the world, then it gets really easy to fall back into the ways of the world.
Like patterns of the, like the world.
Right, falling into the same stuff that they're being warned against doing. Not necessarily accused of doing, but being warned against doing. Because Peter knows that with their growing opposition, there's going to be temptations to do these things. As he, I think it was in chapter 1, but it may have been chapter 2, but he described it as the lust which wage war against the mind, which was talking less about how we refer to lust, but more so about the growing desires in them to retaliate with the same slander, malice, envy, deceit, all those things that the world does to us, or just the world does to each other, that we're called not to reciprocate. Because all those things don't show faith in God. What else? Was there anything else we've talked about? Do y'all feel like needs to get addressed?
Maybe just one final thing is that another theme that's been throughout the whole thing is just subjection to authority. Like just submitting yourself to authorities. Mainly because I think that's probably one of the hardest things that they're currently going through. Especially, like you mentioned this already. We don't know exactly what these people were going through, right? We just know that it seems like they were being persecuted in some way. It could have just been verbal, right? It doesn't seem like maybe they've crossed, at this point, the line into a physical persecution, but it could be. We don't know. Because he does talk about a fiery trial and stuff like that. So it seems like Peter expects it to get worse. And I think he knows that the greatest temptation will be to lash out against those in authority, right? Because naturally the human heart doesn't like submitting to authority, and that's the easiest way where we justify not listening, right? I mean, as Christians, we cannot stand stealing, and we cannot stand murder, and we cannot stand when people covet too much. But whenever it comes to like disobeying authorities, we're pretty lax with that. Because naturally that's like one of the first things to go. Because we like being our own independent person who doesn't have to listen to anybody. And if you're living in a culture where the leadership is increasingly less godly, there's going to be a temptation to lash out. And I think Peter recognizes that that will be the thing that breaks them if they're not careful, right? If their whole thing is about being like keeping their conduct pure and enduring through hardship, well, part of that hardship might be submitting to authorities who are just jerks and who do not care about you, and so I don't know, like he's emphasized that on several times in several chapters. Mm-hmm. So it seems like something probably worth just at least mentioning, not necessarily lingering on, but
yeah, no, but for sure though, and I think that like that in of itself is also like, because I can see it, you can see it today, but it's another evidence of the world rubbing off on us. Because I mean, heck, look at American culture. That's the very premise of it, is that you be your own person and you do your own thing, and kind of
freedom.
I mean, like, I'm not necessarily complaining that America exists, but the whole thing is that it was kind of founded on rebelling against authority. Yeah. And we're not obviously going to debate about whether that was the right thing to do. But regardless, I mean, you see that in the way people are nowadays, increasingly individualistic, which, that's just how the world is. As we've seen certain things unfold. I mean, we talked about the pandemic and stuff. There were times where it did seem like the church was pretty willing to disobey authority, and it's probably something that needs to be thought through a little bit more. Whenever things like that come up, but we probably didn't need that to reveal it in our own churches, if that makes sense.
I say let's do it.
Yeah, I'd say it's probably good. So we can go and hop in. We're starting in verse 6, but I'm just going to go ahead and start in verse 1 and read through just to flow into it. Therefore, I exhort the elders among you, as your fellow elder and witness of the sufferings of Christ, and a partaker also of the glory that is to be revealed. shepherd the flock of God among you, overseeing not under compulsion, but willingly, according to God, and not for dishonest gain, but with eagerness, nor yet as lording it over those allotted to you, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. You younger men, likewise, be subject to your elders, and all of you, clothe yourselves with humility toward one another, for God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Therefore humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you at the proper time, casting all your anxiety on him, because he cares for you. Be of sober spirit, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. But resist him, firm in the faith, knowing that the same experiences of suffering are being accomplished among your brethren who are in the world. And after you have suffered for a little while, the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, strengthen, confirm, and ground you. To him be might forever and ever. Amen. Any thoughts, questions, concerns, fun facts?
I like the image of casting all your stuff that bothers you in your life to him, like you're just getting rid of it.
Mm-hmm.
I picture casting like a ball of worries on Christ.
Mm-hmm. We'll talk about that. Anything else?
You can feel him wrapping it up. Like it's like he's just like it's almost like he's hit all his main points, and now he's like, hey guys, here's just some final words of advice, and also like a general theme that like, yeah.
Yeah, I mean it kind of does summarize a lot of the main ideas he's been talking about. All right, I guess we can go ahead and start going through verse by verse. Therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you at the proper time. Stop there. What's he saying there? So, I guess first of all, what is this? What is verse 6 building off of? What did he just talk about?
God being opposed to the proud and giving grace to the humble. Giving grace to the humble.
Mm-hmm. Well, he was quoting the proverb where he said that about God, and then before that he said to, clothe yourselves with humility towards one another, right? In the more specifically, I guess, in the context of the elders being an example to the younger and to the flock, and then the younger Christians or newer Christians, however you want to think of it. Basically, the people below submitting to the elders, and in the context of that, they talked about clothing themselves in humility, because God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So, just with that in mind, what is he saying here?
I think that this isn't necessarily exactly what he's saying. I guess it's just implied by what he's saying.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like the subtext of everything he's been communicating is that as humans, it's not our responsibility to exalt ourselves, whereas we always feel like it is.
Mm-hmm.
But he's saying, no, if you're going to be exalted, let God be the one who does it, right? You don't have to exalt yourself, right? Your job is not to make it the Sean show or David show. It's not our job to make it about us.
Right.
We're supposed to be like John the Baptist, right? He must increase, I must decrease. And he's just saying, so stop busying yourself with that. That's what worldly people do, right? They busy themselves with trying to make themselves look good. And he says, that can't be you, right? Humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, right? Recognize that you are this tiny pebble, and he's got this mighty hand, right? You are infinitesimally small in comparison to his splendor. And so just exalt him, because that's what you exist to do. You don't exist, like, it sounds kind of silly whenever you put it that way, but like whenever we look at like an ant, does an ant exist to exalt itself? No. We look at ants and we're like, ants are puny and silly, right? It's like none of us looks at an ant and says, yes, that is the center of the universe, right? And that's because we're bigger than the ant. Well, for all we know, if you're in the mind of an ant, it thinks that it's like hot stuff, right? But that's what we think about ourselves, right? We go about our day-to-day lives being like, man, how can I make myself look good? How can I make everybody love me? Yada, 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 so on and so forth. And he's saying, no. There's one person who everything revolves around, and it's God. Your job is to exalt him. And let him decide if you're going to be exalted, right? And he'll do that in his due time. It's not your job. And practically speaking, this just makes better sense, right? It reminds me of the parable that Jesus says about it's not even a parable. It's just a general word of advice. Whenever he's talking about people sitting around a table, and in that ancient culture, there was you basically sit in like a rank, like a social class rank, to where the highest ranked person would sit at one end, and then it would go all the way around to the lowest class. And Jesus says, don't sit at the highest spot on the table. Because if you sit at the highest spot on the table, well, what if the host comes in and moves you down? That's humiliating. And then that means that you had you had a higher opinion of yourself than the host did. That's embarrassing. He says, instead, take your spot at the lowest seat of the table. Because then, worst comes to worst, you put yourself at the right spot, and you chose the path of humility. But, who knows? The host might come in and move you up. In which case, through your humility, you pave the way to being exalted. And so just practically speaking, it makes more sense to not go around with your chin held high, make yourself look good, because all you can do is be destined to fail. Right? It's kind of like this one, hopefully he's not going to listen to this, but I had an athlete last year who, honestly, even if he did listen to this, I don't mind, because I talked to him about it. But he was a little bit arrogant, right? And it was because every time he would run, he would set a new PR. And the thing is, whenever you do that, you're just destined to fail. Because one day you're not going to set that PR, and if you're going around boasting about it, well, everybody else is just, they're no longer rejoicing in your success. They're waiting for you to not succeed because they're ready for you to be humbled, right? And basically, Jesus is like, don't be like that, right? It's just better to be humble, and then along the way, God will eventually exalt you. And so, I don't know, like I said, that's not exactly what he's saying. That's kind of like the subtext behind all of it, both last week's and this week's too, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does. What else? What is the imagery of humbling yourself under the mighty hand of God?
Acknowledging that you're small compared to him. Like, telling him, I'm small, you're bigger than I am. You have the right to do with me as you will.
Mm-hmm.
Something sort of like that.
Yeah, there is that. There is definitely that too. I mean, well, I think what you're talking about is also with the hint of which goes in with this. You can't have really one without the other, but the idea of submitting to God.
I still think hands are created by God will be powerful, so hands are created man, created the earth, created like a sculptor.
I guess the question I'm asking is it's a pretty simple question. Just what's the idea of going putting yourself under the arm, under the hand of God?
Submission?
Yeah, like that, or I guess what I was thinking of protection.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know if that's necessarily what he's going for, but
See, in my head, what I immediately thought, and this could just be because we've talked about it being written to Jewish people or something like that. I thought of Jacob wrestling with God.
Yeah.
And if you remember the story, Jacob, in the end, he doesn't humble himself, right? He just keeps fighting. And he won't submit under the mighty hand of God. Like literally God is wrestling with him to where what God eventually has to do is humble him. Right? He has to pop Jacob's hip out of socket and give him a new name. And he says, you know what? You're done being called the trickster. You're called the God wrestler now. Because that's how stubborn and proud you are. Literally, God can show up and wrestle with you all night, and you won't back down. And so, it's almost like Peter saying, don't be Jacob. Right? Just don't be that. Right? If God's hand is on you, humble yourself. Just submit. Right? It's better to not push back because, like, in the grand scheme of the context of what he's been talking about, persecution is coming for them, and they don't necessarily know why. Right? It could be discipline from God. It could be a test from God. But ultimately, it's something that God is allowing. And so the persecution comes from the hand of God. Either because he's testing them, disciplining them, allowing them to be tempted, any of that stuff, right? And so I think it's like, the implication is like, hey, don't resist that. Right? If you fight against, like if you rebel against the people who are persecuting you, or if you don't submit to authorities, to you, it might feel like you are simply rebelling against authorities or being mean back to somebody who's mean to you. But in reality, what you're doing is you're wrestling against God. Because you're not accepting your lot in life. And you're not accepting what he has put you through. Right? And he's saying, just learn to be content and just humble yourself. It's not your job to, pull yourself up by the bootstraps and make your life what you want it to be. It's like, if God has sent this, it's your job to respond in a godly manner, no matter what comes your way. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that does make sense. So the other question would be, what does this mean by exalting, like exalting you? So if, in this sense, humbling yourselves and him exalting you are kind of like being compared here, it might be a simple question, but what does it mean by exalting you?
Could it be like he's moving you up to something like better, or like something that you didn't have before, but you were ready for at the time he's intended for you?
It could be. I just want us to wrestle through that so that we know what he's actually saying. So he's saying, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, and we talked about how that seems to mainly be talking about submitting to God, that he may exalt you at the proper time. So that he may what? Does that make sense that I'm asking? It's not a trick question or anything.
So when he uses the word exalt here, there's probably two different ways it could be viewed. And both of them really, whenever he says at the proper time, I think it's clear what time he's specifically talking about. And both of these different explanations could be true at that same time. Mm-hmm. So on one hand, exalt could just be a reference to, in general, being lifted up from a lowly state. Right? That's more just the general way we use exalt in day-to-day language. Right? It's you honor somebody. Right? You receive your reward or something like that. Right? If they are being persecuted now, they will be exalted later. Right? That's the very base meaning. But then we also use the word exaltation to almost to talk about, glorification. If there's justification, sanctification, glorification, it's the moment you receive the resurrected body. Right? And so if they are being persecuted now in bodies that decay and fall apart, one day they will be exalted by God and they will receive a new body which will not decay or fall apart. Mm-hmm. And I think both of those forms of exaltation will take place at the same time. And if you want to know what time that is, all you have to do is go back to the previous verses. Because if you go back to verse 4, it says, "And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. You younger men likewise be subject to your elders." Right? So it seems like the proper time would be when the chief shepherd, Jesus, appears, and he gives them the unfading crown of glory. Right? He is giving them the reward, which will also involve the resurrected bodies. Right? I'm not saying that's exactly what he means, but the context would seem to suggest that's probably at least what he has in mind.
Yeah. No, that would make sense. And a lot of, like, we've talked about how kind of littered throughout this letter, but also really a lot of the New Testament, the whole revelation of Jesus is kind of littered throughout. And it makes sense why. But, and he's talked a lot about, like, time in that sense too. So the time is coming, the appointed time, and the time was indicating within the Spirit, you know, all that. Yeah, just that's what I was thinking too. Like, if you interpreted it as either a more immediate or a less immediate way, like, I think even just the words there, exalt and humble, like, literally just refer to, like, being brought low or being brought high. And in that sense, it makes me kind of think of when we talked about James. We emphasized a lot about how the temptation was to get out of the trial or to kind of flee the difficulty of it.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas James was kind of urging them to actually, like, not necessarily like embrace, like, just random suffering, but to in a sense, I mean, embrace the trial and understand what it is, why God has you there. And I think in that sense, you could say that here, when he says, humble yourselves under the mighty arm of God, I mean, if God is allowing you to go through something, and by submitting, you are willingly going through it and, like, trying to figure out why, and like why you're there, and, like, what there is that God has you to learn, or whatever it may be, especially in the context of trials, you know, testing your faith and strengthening it. So rather than fleeing those trials, the fiery trials, you're actually supposed to, you know, humble yourselves under the hand of God and trust in Him, and understand that those trials have something to offer, more so than what you have to gain from getting out of them. But in doing so, God is going to take you out of that situation at the proper time. So once it's kind of had its purpose, so to speak, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So in that sense, the proper time, the exalting at the proper time could be being lifted up out of some sort of humbling situation, whether it's opposition or some sort of trial or hardship. Or, like you said, it could be that this is talking more long term.
Yeah.
That's the humbling yourselves is more of almost this time in the flesh, which he has talked about.
Yeah. Well, and that could be a big part of it, is that the ambiguity of the phrase "the proper time" is kind of the point, because we're not the one who decides the proper time, right?
Mhm.
Whether it's in this life or when the chief shepherd appears, it's up to God. So it's like He's the one who decides when the time is proper. We don't.
Yeah, it's not our choice. It's not our decision to take ourselves out of those situations and to, like, cut things off even before it's time. Anything else for that part of verse 6? Or for verse 6? Does that make sense? Okay. Therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that He may exalt you at the proper time, casting all your anxiety on Him, because He cares for you. What's he saying there in verse 7? Kind of makes me think, I think we have already talked about this, but it kind of makes me think about the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus talks about be not anxious for tomorrow, for today, like, or is it tomorrow will worry for itself?
Yeah, tomorrow has
Okay.
enough troubles of its own, basically.
Mm-hmm. And it talks about how, like, the birds of the field and like all the the flowers too. He talks about like how, they don't have to, God takes care of them. So how much more will He take care of His children? Kind of makes me think of that too, a little bit.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out if maybe he's using the word anxiety here different than how we typically use it.
Mm-hmm.
Just because.
What's the word?
I don't know. I'll look it up. So verse 7.
Yeah.
So it is quoting some scripture. I'll look up what scripture it is in a second. The word for anxiety is merimna. Yeah. Just care, anxiety. It seems like care might make more, like casting your cares on Him. That seems to make more sense to me in context than the word anxiety, because whenever we use the word anxiety, we have like a very specific thing in mind, right? We're thinking of like stress. And I think he is describing stressful situations, but if you interpret this as cares, I think that it's specifically like all this is in the context of proud and like the proud and the humble. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like he's not just. I mean, obviously we should cast all our anxieties to Him in general as well, because you should cast all the things that stress you out. But I think he's specifically talking about our feel to make a name for ourselves, right? Our need to exalt ourselves, right? Like it seems like that chiefly is the thing that he has in mind when he's talking about the cares, right? Cast your cares on Him, right? Rather than you feeling the need to do all this stuff for yourself, release it to Him, right? That's part of faith, right? It is not your job to exalt yourself. It is your job to submit to God and let Him deal with that. And then he says, because He cares for you, right? So cast all your cares on Him because He cares for you, right? He can decide that stuff better than you ever could, right? And so yes, I think that technically if you just took this verse out of context and just interpreted it about anxiety in general, it also works and is a true statement. But I feel like he probably has something a little bit more specific in mind just in regards to how he's using it.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you argue that like he's getting broader. Because he is going to start saying some more broader, just like applicational stuff. And so this could be where he's kind of making that transition. But since it kind of belongs to the same sentence, it seems like it's supposed to kind of tie in.
Yeah. No, I see what you're saying. I guess, whether I definitely could be wrong. I guess the way I was reading it was that to me, like, when I was looking at, like, especially looking at back at the word, it seems like it's more about like cares, like objects, like of anxiety, which to me just seems more like things that most people would be anxious about, like not having, which to me would seem to refer to things like just general needs, like almost like food, water, shelter type stuff, clothing. So I'm trying to fit that in the context of like, I feel like that doesn't make as much sense in the context of like the humble and the proud. But to me, it does make sense if the humiliation and exaltation has more to do with like general circumstances, like the idea of being in a low place, possibly because of opposition, to not allow those worries about holding on to certain things prevent you from acting in a way that is faithful.
Yeah. Well, and also, I guess if you think about it like this, it goes back to the phrase under the mighty hand of God, right? To where you're trusting Him to provide for you, right? Humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God. This could go back to what you were saying about the mighty hand, where it's almost like His hand of provision.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? So He could therefore humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that He may exalt you at the proper time, casting all your anxieties on Him because He cares for you, right? Like you don't have to worry about these things because you're humbling yourself under Him, right? You don't feel the need to provide for yourself, right? In which case that does kind of tie back to the Sermon on the Mount thing like you were talking about, right? And He's like, guys, look at the birds. Are they stressing out? No. They're just living life and their God provides for them, right? What about the lilies of the field? Are they stressing out? No. They're just existing and God provides for them.
Like, I guess it doesn't really apply strict like as well, because I can't really think of a time that I'm probably gonna ever have the threat of being like fired from my job for acting in a faithful way, but like for these people, there seems to be, you know, just to give an example with the whole authority thing, you know, if this authority figure is someone who is in charge of their paycheck, whether it's government or whether it's a business person, or whether it's a result of the slander, malice, envy, deceit that gets around, that gets you out of a job, or, you know, just for whatever reason in that situation, like it'd be easy to convince yourself that you need to first take care of those needs before you can, like, do certain, like, I'm trying to think how to explain. Those things would be an obstacle in a sense, because you'd be too concerned onto, oh, well, I got to have my job, but, you know, or I got to have this or I got to have that, and it actually is an obstacle to you.
It becomes a stumbling block.
Yeah, like it becomes a stumbling block. Whereas if you understand, again, it's the faith that God is just and that He will provide, then you don't have to worry about holding on to any of those things, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if that's what it's saying, but especially for people who actually have to worry more about that. Nowadays, it's like I'm not really in danger of losing a job or losing anything like that's going to affect my hierarchy of needs.
Yeah.
Or, I mean, maybe it could be like other people or like, you know, children or something too. What else do y'all think? Anything like you have to add to that? Just to what I was saying.
Yeah. Well, it's not really adding to what you were saying. I just noticed that for some reason, like in the LSB, it puts casting all your anxiety on Him in capital letters, which usually implies that there's some sort of cross-reference for it, like in the Old Testament.
Like a direct quotation.
Yeah, but I couldn't find one, unless maybe it's quoting the Septuagint.
Yeah, so I did notice that mine did have the
Yeah.
lettering.
But maybe, let me go look real quick. Let me go to a commentary here. Oh, it is. Okay. It's the Septuagint, Psalm 55:22.
Oh, okay.
Psalm 55:22. The ESV says, "Cast your burden on Yahweh, and He will sustain you. He will never permit the righteous to be moved." Real quick, let me go grab the... I'm trying to think, where's my Septuagint at? Oh, it's right over here, I think. Oh, it was over here. Oh no, I lost it.
Oh,
It's alright, I'll find it.
eventually.
Just because I want to see what it specifically says. Y'all can keep talking.
Is it your brown one?
No.
What else there about? So we're still on verse 7 here, but did y'all have any more thoughts about verse 7 with the anxiety and the He cares for you?
You can rest assured that since God has you, you don't have to worry about anything in life. And He's carrying you.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, jeez. So I found Psalm 55, but the numbers are all weird. Okay. No, it's not it either. Okay, found it. It's one of those things where in the Septuagint, the Psalms are numbered differently.
Oh, yeah.
But okay, so it says, "Cast your care on the Lord, and He Himself will nurture you. He will never give shaking to him who is righteous." So it's specifically casting your care on the Lord. That's what it's talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So if you were to read a little bit more of it, going a few verses earlier, "For there was no change for them, and they did not fear God. He stretched out His hand when He paid back." So that's interesting. It uses the language of God's hand being stretched out. He stretched out His hand when He paid back. They violated His covenant. They were divided due to the anger of His face, and His heart drew near. His words became smoother than oil, and they are missiles. Cast your care on the Lord, and He Himself will nurture you. He will never give shaking to him who is righteous. But as for you, O God, you will bring them down into a well of corruption. Men of blood and treachery shall not live out half their days, but as for me, I will hope in you, O Lord. So basically, the verse is surrounded by proclamations that God will judge the wicked, but he will exalt the righteous. And that's in the context of casting your cares to God. Mm-hmm. That makes a little bit more sense, right? Like,
yeah.
That's what I love whenever there's like quotations, because it helps you understand the passage, because we're trying to figure out, what does he mean by casting all your anxiety? Well, if you go read that psalm, it is the exact same context that Peter's talking about here. It's talking about the wicked suffering and the righteous ultimately being exalted, and how ultimately the psalmist's conclusion is, I will hope in the Lord, right? So I will place my hope in him that one day he will exalt me, right? Even if that's not today, right? Like that's like the psalmist is committing that in the present, though I suffer, I will hope in the Lord because I believe that one day he will exalt me, and therefore I can cast all my cares to him, right? And so that kind of makes sense. Like it's specifically in the context of, you can trust that he will do what he said he's going to do.
Yeah. Your
job is simply to be faithful.
Yeah, it's again going back to the whole having faith that God is just and that he will take care of all that stuff. Okay, we can go ahead and move on to verse 8. Be of sober spirit, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Stop there. What's he saying there? He's saying a couple things, but
be of sober spirit, be watchful. I think he's giving them a warning that their physical adversaries aren't the only people they got to worry about, right? That if you think about this, even in the context of what they've been talking about people like persecuting them and stuff like that, they need to be aware that there might be more at play here than simply one person not liking you as a Christian and being mean to you, right? There's this whole spiritual realm that we also have to take into consideration, and therefore we have to be sober-minded, right? Like you can't just to discredit the spiritual realm is to be drunk in the mind of the Christians, right? Mm-hmm. Like the early Christians. You have to be, to be sober is to realize there's this unseen realm out there that is actively trying to lead you into sin. It's just a reality. And therefore you have to be watchful for it. And whenever somebody lashes out at you and they're being a jerk to you, well, rather than lashing out back at them, maybe take a breath and think, would the powers of darkness have any motive for trying to inspire me to lash out in anger? Oh yeah, they probably would. Because they want me to sin against God. And so I think he's just kind of saying, slow down and recognize that situations are never as simple as they seem at first. Right? Whenever you get into an argument with a person, recognize that they have all these different things that are influencing them, some of which are internal, some of which are external, and some of which are both internal and external because they come from this unseen realm, right? And the devil himself could be influencing this stuff. And then he says that the devil's like a lion, right? Comparison to God, the devil's a chihuahua. But comparison to us, he's a lion. And he will eat us up if we're not careful. And so it's just like a general caution. Be like, hey guys, just don't be too hasty.
Yeah, that's true.
Verse reminds me also in Genesis in the story of Cain and Abel, whenever it says that sin is crouching at your door and its desire is for you and it's your job to rule over it. I guess the imagery it's kind of painting there, it reminds me of that verse for some reason whenever you had read it.
You said which one again?
It's in Genesis, in the story of Cain and Abel, whenever it says that like sin is crouching at the door and its desires for you, and it's your job to like rule over it. Just like I think like the imagery of it talking about like the roaring lion and it's like looking for someone to devour. It paints the same like imagery in my head, I guess.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. It's like kind of the idea of being like vigilant and watchful. Like you can't be taken by surprise.
Mm-hmm. And it's always there. Like it's consistently always there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's something we don't really talk about a whole lot, but like the biblical, especially in the New Testament, the biblical portrayal of the unseen realm is frankly terrifying. Like, I don't know, like whether you're in Peter or if you're reading like Paul in Ephesians when he's talking about like the armor of God, like the reason you need the armor of God is not just so you have like a good day, right? That's usually how we talk about it, right? You need to have the armor of God so you can get through the day. Yes, but armor is for battle, right? Like you don't just wear armor to go to the grocery store, right? You wear armor because you're going out to war. And if you need the armor of God every day, that means that there's a war going on every day. And if you fail to realize that you are in the middle of a war, I hate to break it to you, but you're losing the war. Like that's how it works, right? I mean, if you're in the middle of World War II, crossing through like, you know, all the sorts of like crossfire and stuff like that, and you think that you are living in peace, well, you're gonna die. You're like you're not gonna be prepared, right?
Probably also drunk, but
what's that?
probably also drunk.
Probably also drunk, exactly. But biblically speaking, like whenever you get to the New Testament, it seems like there's like guys, like there is this entire realm of forces out there that actively want to kill you. The imagery that I've used in the past is the idea of walking into a dark room. You know, whenever you walk into a dark room, typically there's like this little flash of anxiety that kind of hits you because you never know what's in that room. Or like maybe more when you walk into like a dark house, right? I don't get like nervous every time I walk into a dark room, I promise. I'm not afraid of the dark. But whenever you walk into a dark house and you're like all alone, there's always this moment where you're like kind of nervous. You're like, what if somebody's in here? And that's why you turn on all the lights. Or whenever you watch like a scary movie and the person starts walking around throughout this dark house, the first thing you think is, hey idiot, turn on the lights.
Yeah.
Because you realize that there could be stuff hiding in the darkness. But usually, whenever we turn on the lights, we breathe a sigh of relief. Because there's nothing there. I was worried for nothing. Biblically speaking though, when it comes to the unseen realm, it's almost like you flip on the lights and your greatest fears have been realized. There are like these horrific demon-like creatures, all of whom have their most deadly weapons aimed directly at your throat. And if you just slightly budge, they will kill you. Like that is the biblical portrayal of what like the domain of darkness is like. And it's literally like if you're not careful, like there are these forces and they want you to fall and they want to take you down and you need to be prepared. Like that's just, frankly, it's absolutely terrifying. And you can see why somebody would have a lot of anxiety about that. And that's why Peter says, cast your anxiety to him, right? It's literally like, because if you're just worried about it and if you spend your entire life being like paralyzed or petrified because of these unseen forces, you're gonna be living in fear constantly. But it's like, no, even in that, you have to trust yourself to God. And if you can get yourself to hope in God, and if you can make your single ambition to be as close to Him as possible, then those forces aren't going to stand a chance. But I don't know, I just, anytime the Bible talks about that stuff, it's like they're not kidding around, but we never talk about it. Like we just kind of breeze through it and we're like, ooh, the devil's a lion, And it was like, guys, no, the devil's a lion. Like, would you, like, what if there's a lion in this room right now? Right? If there's a lion in this room right now, do you think we'd just be like sitting still?
Nope.
No, we'd be freaking out.
Be running.
And it's like, no, the devil's a lion, and here's the tricky part. You can't see him. Right? Like, imagine there was an invisible lion. Like, just imagine there was an invisible lion that existed in the world. Would that not make you a little bit more nervous constantly?
Yeah.
Right? Like, one thing that reassures me about lions is that, you know, if there was a lion nearby, I'd probably know it. You know? And even then, I mean, that's only because I'm a human. Right? Lions typically aren't chasing after humans. The animals that lions do chase after, they usually don't know the lion's there until the moment the lion pounces. Right? And so, to the ones that are typically the prey of the lion is invisible. Right? So, like, that's got to be terrifying. And so for us, it's like there's a lion out there. He's invisible and he's ready to pounce, and you are not going to hear him pounce until he wants you to know. And that should scare us, but it shouldn't scare us to the point of anxiety. It should scare us enough to leave us running to God. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does make sense. Which is ultimately why you're humbling yourself under the mighty hand of God, because, well, He's more powerful than the devil.
Man, pick up for that.
Yeah. What else there for verse 8?
What's the word for devil there? Is it like Diablo?
Yeah.
Diablos. Yeah.
Diablos.
Yep.
Just like, oh, sorry, what were you going to say?
Let's say adversary. I think it just means unrighteous. Oh, opponent. Yeah. Antidikos.
Yeah.
Not important. Anyways, what were you gonna say?
So I was going to like break down just the different things, like being of sober spirit and being watchful, like what that means. The idea, like the reason you use that language is of being on guard. Like this is all not necessarily warrior imagery, because he's not talking about armor or anything here, but it's the mindset of a warrior, right? It's somebody like why is it that? Let me just ask you this question: why would you need to be sober? Besides the fact that God obviously says that drunkenness is wrong, but like in reality, like why is it that soberness is important? Like why is sobriety important?
To be in control of your mind and body, your physical acuity. If you're drunk, you tip over, you fall, you can't see straight, that kind of thing. You need sobriety to have clear vision, to hear the threats, maybe the lions wrestling in the grass, you can hear it, see it, and have your senses about you.
Exactly, right? So sobriety is important because it makes you alert, right? And that's the danger of alcohol. That's why God says, don't get drunk, right? You can have some alcohol, but don't get drunk, because like you lose important things, right? Like God wants you to like not get in a car and go wreck it because you were drunk driving, right? And right here, he's not talking about alcohol, but he's using the imagery of alcohol, right? He's saying, guys, you need to be a sober spirit, right? There are other things that will drunken you up,
Another
right?
thing
And it
is-
doesn't have to be alcohol. Yes.
Another thing is your thinking. You need clear thinking because the devil can use the mind. He can outwit people. The devil's clever, so he uses his wit to trick people. And if people could just think clearly, their sound mind could be their defense.
Yeah. Well, and this is why he brings up sober spirit and watchful together, I think. Because, like I said, sobriety, the image of that is alcohol. But the meaning that he's trying to convey is much broader than that. Because there are a number of things in life that can intoxicate us, right? It's simple, just our desires, right? If we really like money, well, that will intoxicate us, right? And it will keep us from thinking clearly, right? If we are addicted to sex, well, that's gonna keep us from thinking clearly, right? It's gonna keep us from being sober, and that's why we have to be watchful, right? Because you have to understand your strengths, you need to understand your weaknesses, you have to understand the various different things that could potentially sway you, right? And that means you have to be on guard constantly. As Christians, it's not like we really have the option to just turn our minds off. Like, I don't know, a lot of people in culture, they say, I just want to turn my mind off. We don't have that luxury, right? We have to be on guard at all times, right? But the cool thing is that we have rest in Christ, and serving Him gives us rest, but we're called to be on guard, right? Because we have to be aware that, literally anything, if we are not careful, can make us prey to temptation, right? I mean, just, something that didn't tempt you 3 days ago could become the thing that gets you this day because you let your guard down, right? Like whenever it comes to watching pornography, it's not like, somebody started doing that whenever they came out of the womb. And it's not like they were tempted by it whenever they were 3 years old. No. It didn't tempt them at the beginning, but at some point it got them. And it's probably because they did not have a sober mind and they weren't watchful, right? It's not like, obviously pornography is a more extreme case. I think there's a lot more subtle cases that Peter probably has in mind. Because he hasn't been talking about stuff like that. He's been talking about retaliation, right? He's been saying, guys, whenever somebody lashes out at you, you've got to realize, right there, that is an intoxication moment, right? That person insulting you is intoxicating your pride, right? And it's going to make you offended. And you're not going to be thinking clearly in that moment. If you're not watchful, you are going to lash out back at them and you're going to feel justified that you did it. But that's because you weren't thinking with a sober mind. You were responding drunkenly, right? They tempted your pride and your pride responded. You can't do that, right? And so it's literally like everything you do, you've got to keep yourself in check. And if somebody lashes out to you, you've got to realize, okay, they just insulted me. My pride is probably hurt. If I'm going to respond to them, I need to make sure that I'm not responding out of pride, right? And so you're having to check yourself, which it forces you to move slower. It forces you to not just make impulsive decisions. And in general, it just helps you make smarter choices, right? A person who is drunk, like with alcohol, they're more likely to just do stuff impulsively because they're not thinking, right? Whereas a sober-minded person, they're more likely to, be more cautionary, right? A drunk person, somebody jumps off a bridge, let's go, and they'll just like dive off. Whereas a sober person, they're going to look and they say, okay, well, let's see. This might be a little too high to jump off of, right? If it's a lower bridge, okay, cool, let's do it. But how deep's the water, right? A sober person, they're going to think about those things. And he's just saying, you got to be aware that every single interaction, there might be something in there that's tempting you to sin. And it can show up anywhere, right? When you're working at the grocery store, when I'm at school, I deal with students, right? And my students inherently are asking me biblical questions, right? Like they want to know biblical stuff. And it's easy for me in that position to think, okay, I'm a Bible teacher. They're asking me biblical questions. What could go wrong here? Several things, right? Whenever I respond to them, what am I trying to accomplish? Am I simply trying to make myself look really knowledgeable? Or is there a way where I could reword my question to where the glory goes more to God than to myself, right? What am I trying to accomplish with how I respond to the question, right? Am I trying to simply give them knowledge, or am I unintentionally leading them astray and actually guiding them into, giving them knowledge that really they just need to have faith on, right?
Is there a root to sin like pride that has a diversity of expression? Like there's a core to it that in different people it's totally different?
I'm not sure what you mean.
Like does sin have a root? Like we're saying that there's different sins, but is there a root to sin?
Fun fact, I was actually writing about this in my journal right here today, reflecting on it. So temptation is ultimately at the root of sin, right? Because temptation is the thing that makes sin justifiable in our minds, right? If there was no temptation, we probably just, the only people who would be sinning are the ones who just wanted to, right? And sometimes we do want to. But temptation is at the root of sin, but then you have to ask what's at the root of temptation, and I would say desire, right? What you desire is the thing that's going to tempt you. And the thing I was wrestling through in my journal today, it's more of a philosophical question, but I was trying to figure out what's at the root of desire, right? Like where do desires come from? Why do different people desire different things?
Exactly.
That's a hard question to answer. But that's what I was wrestling through. But in order to be of sober spirit and be watchful, that's why we need to wrestle through stuff like that. Because if I realize that the path to sin begins with my desires, the best thing I can do to be of sober mind is figure out why I desire the things I desire, right? Like if I start noticing, man, I am tempted in these ways. Well, I shouldn't just say, okay, I'll do better next time. No, I need to say, why, right? What is it that is tempting me here, right? Maybe I'll find a friend who's not tempted that way, and I need to talk with them and figure out, okay, what is it that you value, right? Like we need to sit down and figure out why is it that why do I desire this and you don't desire this, right? And wrestling through that together and stuff like that, because you can't truly be of sober spirit unless you are aware of yourself and your surroundings and stuff like that. And I'm not saying aware of yourself in some weird lovey-dovey, love yourself type of way. Mm-hmm. I'm saying this in the sense of, once again, knowing your strengths and weaknesses. Not in a way to where, a job application where you're like, my strength is that I'm extra diligent. I'm saying, being entirely honest with yourself. You need to know, where are you weak, where are you strong, right? And how can you use both of those for the glory of God rather than having both of those taken advantage of and be used for the devil?
I'll tell you the problem with the desire part that reminds me of desire is I read part of Ecclesiastes the other day the part of Ecclesiastes that says, like, if you desire for gold, gold will never satisfy. So no matter what you desire, it's never, your eyes are never satisfied, your ears, your money, power, it's never enough.
Well, I mean, that's why Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes, right? The whole reason he wrote the book is because he was literally a guy who had everything, yet he still desired more. And he realized it's all meaningless, right? And it seems like Ecclesiastes, much of it is literally wrestling through that exact issue. He's like, where does this come from? And that's why by the end he says, fear God and keep his commands. He's like, that's the only thing that makes sense. Even though by the end of the book, it's not like, it doesn't seem like he's come to all the conclusions that he wants to have come to. He simply says, well, this is the only thing that makes sense. But I don't know. A lot of motive to be of sober spirit. I could probably just keep talking about that, but I'm not going to. I'm going to stop.
You're good.
I like to think of temptation as when you go fishing, you give the fish something that they like and desire, like some sort of bait. You know, that's why they like crickets or other small fish, worms. You dangle that in their face and make them desire it and make them want it, but they don't know the hook's underneath it. And that's what catches them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and since we're just bringing up temptation, just a clarification or whatever you call it, but temptation is inevitable, and temptation is not inherently a sin.
Mm-hmm.
But just remember that it's not a line you want to tiptoe at all. I mean, Paul talked a lot about this in Corinthians, but you don't want to flirt with temptation at all. But inherently, it's not what's bad, but you don't want to put yourself in situations that necessarily set you up for failure, if that makes sense, which goes back to, like, you know, knowing your strengths and weaknesses. But I mean, we also talked about in James about how really sometimes the difference between a temptation and a test is intentions, and God can test us, but a lot of times with those tests also come temptations, and so just a matter of, you know, acknowledging those things and ultimately submitting to God over your own desires.
What would you say a test is?
Well, there's not like a dictionary definition, and I think even before we kind of like generally agreed, like, you know, when God tests you, His intention is that you be faithful, that you like choose the right thing, whereas a temptation is more presenting something with the intention of you giving into your desire. Whereas God can put you in a situation where there is a temptation to sin, but His intention is for you. His intention is for you to choose the right thing to do.
Yeah, so the key distinction seems to be just the intention.
Yeah.
Right? To where God, He just wants to see where your faith is at. Whereas, like, the devil, he's tempting you because he wants you to fail.
Yeah, and so like James said, God does not tempt people, and He's never been tempted. But
So God doesn't want you to fail, but He does want. He wants to know, and He wants you to know. Well, I guess more importantly, He wants you to know, because He already knows where our hearts are at.
yeah,
If that makes sense.
yeah, no, that makes sense, and that's, you know, part of how that testing your faith is more precious than gold, because by letting you know where your heart's at, that is what is going to help allow you to move forward. I'm trying to think what else we going to say with that. Just, what was it? I mean, I try not to go to other like books too much, but I mean, like even in 1 Corinthians, you know, Paul will say that God will not allow you to be tempted beyond your ability, and so with a temptation there will be an escape, a way out, like to be able to endure it. And I think that to a degree this is still actually being even conveyed here, because we haven't got to verse 9 yet, but, you know, 6 through 9, none of this really conveys the idea of escaping anything, because all of it is, you're humbling yourself under the mighty hand of God, that He may exalt you at the proper time, which to me implies some degree of enduring through trials, to not give into temptation, and then He will provide a way of escape through it, to endure it.
So as part of Peter explaining to Christians, do you have trials versus the misconception that you have an easy good life?
Well, I don't think he's necessarily having to prove that we do, but he's just explaining, he's more so talking about how necessary they are, and that it's important to understand why, like to endure them, and to live faithfully through them, to stand the test of faith.
One thing I want to say about the roaring lion thing, just because I've been in the book of Amos, and it's interesting that Peter classifies the devil like a lion here, but in Amos, the primary image of a lion is actually God, right? So if you go to like Amos chapter 1, he says, "The words of Amos, who was among the sheep herders from Tekoa, which he beheld in visions concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, son of Joash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. And he said, Yahweh roars from Zion, and from Jerusalem he gives forth his voice, and the shepherds' pasture grounds mourn, and the top of Carmel dries up." So basically, Amos, he is a shepherd down in Judah, but God, as a lion, roars from Zion, right, from Jerusalem. And whatever God says, basically the imagery is like God speaks from his temple. And even though Amos is not a prophet himself, he's just a shepherd, he hears what God says, and he feels no choice, but he has to go and declare the message, right? So he ends up going north to Israel to proclaim the message. So it says, God roars from Zion, and the sheep herder from Tekoa goes up to Carmel, right? So it's like, whenever the lion roars, he has no choice but to respond. But then if you go a little bit later on, this is where it becomes relevant to this. Amos asks this question. He asks a series of questions, but some of them are in regards to a lion. And basically, his whole point is he's saying that God would not send a prophet unless there was an issue that needed to be addressed. Right? Like, that's his whole thing. He says, guys, if I as a prophet am standing here, it's because you're in danger. Right? And so he says, you only have, this is God saying, you only have I known among all the families of the earth. Therefore I will punish you for all your iniquities. Do two men walk together unless they've made an appointment? Does a lion roar in the forest when it has no prey? Does a young lion give forth its voice from its den unless it has captured something? Does a bird fall into a trap on the ground when there is no bait in it? Does a trap spring up from the earth when it captures nothing at all? If a trumpet is blown in a city, will not the people tremble? If a calamity happens in a city, has not Yahweh done it? Right? So he asks all these questions. And they're rhetorical questions. Right? He's saying, guys, if the lion roars, that means he's found his prey. Right? Because a lion, if you know anything about lions, they stay very quiet. They stay crouched to the ground when they're tracking the prey. And they roar whenever they're getting ready to pounce. Right? It's like last minute, roar, boom, and they're on top of them. Right? And according to Amos, in his book, Yahweh is roaring. Because he's talking to the people of Israel. He says, guys, I'm coming for you. Right? If I sent a prophet, it's because you need to know what's about to happen. I say all that because there's a biblical expectation, and if Peter's writing to Jewish Christians, they would understand this. When a lion roars, there's danger, because that means the lion has found his prey. Now you read it, your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. So the devil's found his prey, and it's us. Right? He's just choosing which one he wants to try to devour. But he's going to pounce, but the cool thing is that we do have the option whether or not we will be devoured. Right? Because even though this lion is jumping at us, greater is he who is in us than the devil. Right? And so, without God, we're defenseless. And we are prey to the lion. He's going to devour us easily. But with Christ on our side, we stand a chance. but not if we are not sober-minded or watchful.
I think it's kind of interesting that the devil has the domain of the world, that the devil's in the world, and then we think of God as in heaven, and I think Jesus prayed that on earth as it is in heaven. Like, the job of the Christian is to kind of live with heaven in mind,
Mm-hmm.
like to bring that to reality.
Yeah. For certain, for certain.
Anything else there for verse 8?
I don't think so.
Okay, we can move on. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. But resist him, firm in the faith, knowing that the same experiences of suffering are being accomplished among your brethren who are in the world. What's he saying there?
I like that it says accomplished. Does that, do you think that implies a positive connotation? It's something that achieved?
I'm not sure.
I'll look at it.
Okay. So it might just depend on how they're using the word. Because it can just mean being brought about. So it might be neutral.
It might be usually saying this.
Yeah, it might just be saying that like they have gone through this stuff.
So it's epiteleo, which just means to bring to an end, right? It's like epi and teleo.
Okay,
So-
yeah, that's what I figured. Just
to
like
bring to
brought
an end,
about.
accomplish, perfect, execute, complete.
Yeah. So it's more so the idea of just a completed action, which isn't important, but it's just basically just saying that it's being accomplished. So they're going through.
Yeah. Honestly, the word execute, like executed, might be a more like in context appropriate translation, right? If you're like, because it's saying that the same experiences of suffering are being executed among your brethren, right? Because it's saying that they're being performed or accomplished or done, but since it's talking about suffering, executed might like convey like emotionally what he's probably trying to convey.
Oh, yeah. That's true.
Maybe you're trying to give them confidence to say that like you're not the only one. Other Christians suffer. So when you tell people they're not alone, it gives them the strength to resist and to fight back.
That's for sure. I mean, that's another reason why, we always emphasize that, and just why it's important to recognize that our faith is a communal one. It's not just an individual one. Is because there is something to be said about the fact that when you're in a group, whether it's because I guess in this case the other people aren't there, they're around, but knowing there are other people that are willing to go through the same thing as you, it will definitely help motivate you to actually go through that as well.
Well, there's, especially when it comes to hardship in life, there's this sense of bond that almost feels necessary whenever you experience like severe grief or something like that. Because like, this is an example. Obviously, different type of suffering, right? But when it comes to like my dad's death, one of the hardest parts about that whole thing has been like, I don't know, how hard it is to relate to. Because like, I know people who've had loved ones die, but like, what happened with mine was like a very like extreme and like graphic situation. To where it's like, people will be like, oh, like, it'd be difficult because people will be like, oh, I understand what you're going through. I'm like, I don't know if you do. And like, I think for the longest time, it just felt very like lonely. Because it was like, like it's not to where you're like bitter against people, but it genuinely was like, it felt kind of alone because you're like, I want somebody to understand. And what's cool is I've noticed like there's certain students that I've had who, after they've heard the story about what happened with my dad, they've gravitated more towards me. And upon learning their stories more, I've realized that some of them are in the exact same situation, right? They have one of them, their dad died in a car wreck, and they were in the car with them, right? And it was graphic. Like, the whole family was there. And like, keep in mind, I was 22 when this happened. This kid was like 13, right? Like, that's terrible. And then another guy, whenever he was young, he walked into the garage and discovered that his dad had committed suicide.
Oh.
Yeah. And like, it's been interesting seeing how those students, they've kind of gravitated towards me a little bit, and it's never been a thing that we've specifically addressed. But I can guarantee you it's because once they heard, like, it was specifically after they heard my story that I noticed that they started kind of like opening up to me more. And it's just like this unspoken thing of, hey, we're unified in this. We don't even have to talk about it, but we went through it kind of together. And it's something that like other people just can't understand as much, but we get it. And again, that's totally different types of suffering, but that's kind of what he's getting at here. Resist him, firm in the faith, knowing that at the same experiences they're suffering, they're being accomplished amongst your brethren. You're not alone, right? There's other people out there, and they're enduring. And if they're enduring, you can do it too. Honestly, this is kind of like how every musical ends. That might sound kind of weird because we're talking about suffering, but if you think about it, some of the most popular musicals that have ever come out, they always end with a dance number where everybody affirms that we are all in this together, right? High School Musical, there's literally a song that says, it's called We're All in This Together. Grease, right? We go together, right? It's because, like with movies like a musical or something like that, you know, you've got all these people who have their own stories that go do all these other things, but the whole point of a musical is to bring the people together and like end on like a triumphant note where everybody's happy. Well, that's kind of what Peter's doing here, right? He's saying, like, obviously it's not nearly as happy as a musical typically is, but as he's bringing the letter to an end, he's been calling people a whole lot to like personal application, but he's also saying, guys, if there's any encouragement here, you're not going through it alone, right? There are other people out there who are going through what you're doing, and they've gone through worse, right? And Peter probably has people in mind, right? By the time Peter's responding to this, we know that there's at least one disciple who's been killed, right? And that would be James, the brother of John, right? Because he was killed very early on in the church, right? And Peter was good friends with him, right? And we also know that prior to that, Stephen was killed. Peter knew Stephen. And I can guarantee you that there's probably plenty of other people that Peter has known who have died for their faith. And so he's telling the guys, like, hey, we are in this together. It reminds me of the Keith Green song, "O Lord, You're Beautiful." There's this one verse. It's not like they always take this verse out of like a lot of versions of the song. But he says, "O Lord, my body's tired, but you keep reminding me of many holy, tireless men who shed their blood for thee." And then he starts singing, "O Lord, You're Beautiful." Like, I don't know. I think that's really cool because it's like, whenever we feel weak, we can just remember what other people have gone through for Christ. And you say, you know what? If they can go through that, then I can go through this too. Whereas, I don't know, whenever you feel like you're alone going through something, it's easier to justify sinning. Because we could say, oh, nobody understands me. Nobody understands this situation. I'd be justified to act this way. But if you realize there's people out there who've gone through worse, all of a sudden you're like sobered up. And you're like, okay. If Stephen can have stones thrown at him and say, Father, forgive them, well, I guess I can too. So, I don't know. It's a very beautiful phrase there. Like, he doesn't say, like, the path to resisting the devil is not simply, you know, standing toe-to-toe with him and, like, going into a boxing match. The way you resist him is by placing your hope in God, like, firm in the faith, and by surrounding yourself with a community of believers who you know is also committed to the same thing.
I think the devil's tactic is to have people lose their faith in the midst of suffering and trials. To be suffering is to try to like psych them and like get in their heads about disbelieving in God. And then you're talking about these people who there's other Christians, but there's other people out there who also suffer. And then when that happens, I find it surprising but encouraging that when other people suffer greatly, like they turn to God. They look something higher and better than themselves, and they find confirmation of the good in the world despite the harmful things that like do literally occur in our lives.
Yeah.
Yeah, when we're suffering as Christians, sometimes the devil wants us to think, why don't you just give up? You know, there's nothing really to gain from this suffering. You should just give up. But we as Christians know we should let the suffering build us up so that we're stronger because of it.
Yeah, no, that's true. Let's see.
Just affirming the faith. Like the same experiences of suffering. Some people might not like that phrase, same experiences. In Greek, it's literally just same things. Like basically the same things of suffering are being accomplished. A lot of people don't like that idea because they like to think that their experiences are 100% unique. And they like to think, oh, nobody's ever gone through what I've gone through. But that's just not true. Right? Like, we might feel like that sometimes. And I think it's very easy for us to get in our heads and think, nobody relates to me, nobody understands. And that's usually because we feel very, like, especially when you're suffering, you feel very isolated, you feel very apart from everybody. But that's one of those places where it actually, it's good to not feel unique there, right? This is where Ecclesiastes actually becomes comforting whenever Solomon says there's nothing new under the sun. Because normally we don't like it frustrates us and we're like, I just want to be different. Whereas whenever you are suffering, it's like, no. Like, you feel alone. But there's people out there who have gone through the same thing. And that actually should comfort you. Even if the people who went through that experienced death, right? So you're like, hey, well, at least I won't be the only one doing that, right?
When you say dying, you're doing what?
For, like, in this context, for the faith.
Yeah, I've had that thought constantly where, like, in American Christianity, it's different because, like, in the first century, they were crucified, and Stephen was stoned to death. And in America, I don't know of any Christians personally who were physically martyred to that degree.
Yeah.
And so I feel there's, like, a high degree of separation between us and them.
There is, because, I mean, we haven't even begun to deny the most base of our desires for us to be required to deny our lives. You know what I mean? Like, it's like if you just look at our day-to-day interactions, the average Christian, including myself really, we look like everybody else, right? We talk like everybody else. We conduct ourselves in our interactions like everybody else. The only difference is that we throw in Christianese terms sometimes. Words that we've been taught in our churches are the words that Christians should use. But our interactions don't look that different. Our love doesn't look that different. And so I think for us, God's kind of like, guys, I just need y'all to start denying yourselves of like smaller things. Like he's not going to throw us into calculus if we don't know basic math. You know, it's like he's not going to be forcing us to lay our lives down if we can't even begin to like lay our pride down. You know, like it's like he's like, we'll get there when you're ready, but it doesn't seem like we're ready yet. Yeah, which eventually maybe he'll just have to force us, like if we keep, if we continue to not study, he might just force us into calculus anyways, right? And say, okay, learn the hard way, right? And he might say, okay, well, if you're not willing to deny yourself of those things, it's time to see who the real Christians are. And so I would say that if persecution does come for us in America, that's probably what's going to end up happening, unless there's some massive revival.
Wouldn't that be what Sean just said, where, I mean, that'd be a test, God can have a test that you failed, but isn't God's ultimate goal for you to pass?
I think he wants us to pass. I don't know that.
Right,
I don't
his
think.
goal, but
I don't think the
so-
goal of the test is for us to pass. The goal of the test is to expose our hearts, right? Does he want us to pass? Yes. Does God want everybody to come to
that's the
repentance?
question,
Yes. But
yeah.
I think the goal of the test is to expose our hearts, right? As a teacher, I want every student to pass the test. But the goal of the test is to see where they're at, right? That's the point of the test, right? If I had it my way, yes, everybody would pass. But inevitably, that's not what happens, right? Because I guess hypothetically, I could, if the goal of my test was for everybody to pass, I would make a test that if you just wrote your name on it, you passed. But that's not the test I make, right? I make a test that requires the person to do something, right? And that's what God does too, right? I mean, could he hypothetically make it to where everybody passed? Yes, he can make the stakes a lot less severe, right? As long as you pray a magic prayer, bada boom, bada bing, you're a Christian. Cool. It's like, that's a test that anybody can pass, but guess what? Even then people would fail, right? He could have done the Thanos snap and said, boom, all because I snapped my fingers, everybody's a Christian. Well, that's a test that everybody passes because they didn't get a choice. But I think ultimately the purpose of the tests that we go through are to expose our hearts.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like also the reason why you don't just have a final. It's like you have tests before that so that they can then study more if they need to or figure out where they stand.
Yeah, and if we get to the final and we're still not ready, well, that's on us. Because we had warning signs, right? You should have gone for tutoring. You should have looked more in depth to it.
Yeah, whereas if you don't ever get any kind of test, everyone might think that they're all killing it, and then the test comes around and they're just like, I don't know what any of this is, and it's like,
Yeah.
you know, they'll wish they would have been tested.
Yeah.
But yeah, I also kind of think of because I think another way this kind of goes is, you know, the no temptation has overtaken you, which is not common to man. I think also the other thing is that if our experiences of suffering aren't unique, it also kind of takes away any excuse,
Yeah.
which I guess you kind of already touched on, but it just takes away, again, any more excuse to not obey.
Yeah, you literally can't say, nobody's ever gone through this. It's like, yes, they have, right? And also, the issue with that is that it's even, like, for somebody who had the audacity to, anybody who has the audacity to claim that their experience is unique, that's destined to fail too, because they're assuming that they know more than God. All God has to do is say, oh, no. You know, John Doe, who lives over in, Connecticut, he went through the same exact thing, and he passed with flying colors. And then you're just going to be humiliated, because you were too arrogant to submit yourself to the mighty hand of God. And you should have just been like, okay, God, I don't know what I'm doing here, but I'm going to trust that you've gotten people through stuff like this before, and you're going to get me through it. Rather than arrogantly thinking, I am unique, and nobody's ever gone through this, because then you're destined to be humiliated.
Yeah, that's true. Anything else there for verse 9? The same experiences of suffering are being accomplished among your brethren who are in the world.
I think it's kind of cool who he's specifically talking about. He's not talking about members of the local church, right? It's like right here he's speaking of the universal church, right?
Mm-hmm.
Brethren in the world, right? It's like it's almost like the army, military infantry, right? It's like these are people who have been deployed, and you've got the church versus the world, right? The world is the battlefield, and he says, hey, your brothers, they're out there suffering too. It reminds me of Uriah, with the David and Bathsheba story. Whenever David, remember, he has committed this grievous sin. He's swept Bathsheba, got her pregnant. He invites Uriah back home, and he's trying to get Uriah to indulge in his flesh, right? And he's trying to get Uriah to go home and sleep with his wife so that hopefully Uriah can think that he got Bathsheba pregnant. But Uriah says, how could I go and sleep with my wife when my men are out there dying, right? My brothers. So Uriah's obviously Uriah could have just he didn't need to think of the brothers to motivate himself to not sleep with his wife. He could have just said, you know what, I shouldn't do it. But it'd be a lot, if you're not thinking about the men out there suffering, it'd be a lot easier to just give in, right? I mean, Uriah, he's probably exhausted. Apparently Bathsheba was so drop dead gorgeous that literally King David fell for her. Which says something, right? I mean, man after God's own heart commits the most grievous sin possible with this woman, so she's apparently drop dead gorgeous. Uriah would have every reason to go sleep with Bathsheba. And she's his wife, right? It would be the right thing to do, right? But it is him thinking about the suffering of his fellow man that keeps him from doing it. That sobers his mind because he's watchful, right? And he says no. And that's why Uriah ends up being this tragic almost hero, because he dies for being faithful, which ultimately could be what happens to us, right? To where we could die for being faithful, just like Uriah the Hittite. But the thing that should motivate us is not indulging in our flesh, but rather thinking about the brethren out there who are in the world who they're battling too. and they're suffering. And if they're suffering, then we should suffer with them. And if they are denying themselves their desires of the flesh, then we should deny our desires of the flesh as well. I don't know, kind of. That's an interesting thought to me.
Yeah, no, I, that makes sense. I mean, especially for us, because it is hard to kind of. I mean, honestly, it is kind of hard to sometimes see that, to really see the battle going on here. But you hear about Christians in other countries, and people who are actually having to go through like quite literally a battle, if nothing else, if not just going through suffering. Like over in Africa or the Middle East or something.
Yeah.
And I think that probably should be motivating to us.
The thing that it makes me think that under oppression, like if there's somebody persecuting the Christian church, that's when it persecutes. But sort of like in reverse, since there's not persecution, it seems like maybe that's why part of America is stagnating in that area.
Mm-hmm.
It's because there's so much freedom. It just takes that drive away from people to pursue holiness. Because it's so gratified in other ways.
Well, I think both of them feed one another. Because I think that our own lack of motivation to live holy lives and our lack of commitment to God, it makes it to where we're not a threat to the world, right? And I'm not saying we should be a threat to the world where like we're raising our guns to fight. I'm saying that, like according to Jesus, he says, if you were of the world would love you, but because you're not of the world hates you. So if we were actually living differently, and we were actually living like Christ would want, I mean, there would probably be more opposition, right? But since there is no opposition, it's far easier for us to just keep doing what we're doing because it's comfortable. And so I think it really is like a vicious cycle of just, like what really needs to happen is there needs to be somebody who breaks the cycle, right? Either people are just going to start persecuting even just like cultural Christians, in which case that's bad because then the persecution is going to get really bad because that means that they're coming from them. They're definitely going to come for the people who are more serious. Or, and I think this is probably better, Christians just need to step up and we need to start being more like, I don't want to say vocal, we just need to start being more real. We need to start being more faithful. And I think if we did that, then persecution would naturally come. And I think the benefit of, if we're the ones who break the cycle first, the benefit to that is that, I don't know, first off, a lot of cultural Christians get to be spared from suffering. And it would also, the result is that the persecution would be directed at actual godliness, not just like a false sense of godliness. And as a result, the church would probably thin out a little bit, and we'd be able to see who was actually faithful, right? It'd be easier to identify our fellow brothers. Whereas, I don't know, if people just start like turn persecution against the whole church, I don't know, it'd just be a little messier. But yeah, I think it's just a vicious cycle.
Yeah, that makes sense. Anything else out for verse 9?
I would add that Christians who are persecuted today, that applies to them, that they're willing to endure persecution. So logically they feel in touch with the suffering of Christ and the early Christians because they experienced it firsthand.
Mm-hmm.
Like they feel connected to something greater than themselves.
Yeah. We can move on to verse 10.
Yeah, we can probably go through these verses a little bit quicker. Like, it seems like verses 10 and 11 are kind of wrapping up like little thought. It's more like just exalting God and stuff. So, because it already is 8:57,
Yeah.
but we can probably get through these pretty quick.
Mm-hmm. And after you have suffered for a little while, the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, strengthen, confirm, and ground you. To him be might forever and ever. Amen. Didn't that also kind of like, well, I don't think there was any like quoting, but wasn't that also kind of in that psalm we read from? Was it Psalm 55?
I'll look it up.
I don't think it was all those words, but
Do you think if Peter's writing a letter, he has been through a lot personally in his life at this point?
I would assume so for sure. I mean, we only know what happens in Acts and the Gospels, but that already was a lot.
Well, because I'm kind of thinking this is leading by example, that he's praying for younger Christians, but he's kind of set the example. That like he started the church, he's leading it, like he suffered, and now he's blessing them to be able to find strength and all that with God's like that purpose as a church.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I would say he definitely is. He's not focusing on it. Like, I think sometimes Paul puts more of a focus on that. You know, like remember my chains, and he'll say follow my.
Yeah.
He'll say all the time like be imitators of me as I am of Christ.
That's kind of Paul.
I don't think Peter focuses on that as much, but I don't think you can deny that Peter is not asking them to do anything that he hasn't already done himself.
Yeah. Well, I think it's also just implied because, like, especially with the nature of, like, it's there's certain types of teachings that you can give, and, like, you don't have to have personal experience in it to have credibility. But whenever you're telling people to suffer, like, nobody's going to listen unless you actually know what you're talking about. Like, because typically, whenever people, like, you know, like, and when somebody's suffering and you try to comfort them, usually their go-to is, you just don't understand. And that's just human nature. And so I think the implication would be that, yeah, he's gone through this stuff too. Because if not, it'd probably be wiser of him to just be like, hey, Paul, can you write a letter to these people? Because they'll listen to you more than me.
Yeah, that's true.
I feel like, did this phrase show up earlier in the book? Just the phrase suffered for a little while?
I was trying to think where it's from. I think there might have been a similar thing. I'm not sure if it was the same phrase.
Let's see.
You know when it says strengthen? I always think of like, oh, it'll encourage me, like, oh, you'll just do better. But I think it means like resist, like the way to build muscles by like strength, like resistance. So he's like blessing them with like strength, but you don't get stronger without going through trials. Like he's also implying you're going to go through trials.
Mm-hmm. And I think also verse 10 kind of goes back to verse 6.
Okay.
Just the idea of suffering for a little while, kind of correlated back to humbling yourselves. And then the restore strength and confirming ground is kind of tying back to like the exalting you. If he's lifting you up out of a situation. In this case, it's talking about, you know, the roaring lion and resisting him.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I could be wrong, but that's kind of how it reads to me, at least. Because he's saying, like, when it says resist him, to me, the idea is that there isn't really the possibility that you're not going to have to face him.
Exactly.
I mean, I guess he could just. I guess that could be there, but he doesn't say if he happens to find you, resist him, or how to avoid him. He just says resist him. And then after you have suffered for a little while. So, you know, you may have to endure, but you submit to God, and God in His time is going to bring you out of that situation. So He will restore, strengthen, confirm, and ground you.
So I didn't find where it was at, and this is where you can tell that he is bringing the book to a close, because it's in chapter 1. He says, "In this you greatly rejoice, even though now, for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the proof of your faith, being more precious than gold, which is perishable, even though tested by fire, may be found to result in the praise and glory and honor of the revelation of Jesus Christ."
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, but I just knew that phrase "for a little while" Like, I remember it stuck out to me, and I couldn't remember if it was just because of reading 1 Peter several times before, but it's because it was at the beginning of 1 Peter. I just love that phrase. And after you have suffered for a little while. Like, so the book began with him saying, guys, you might have to suffer, even if for a little while. But then now, at the end, he's saying, and after you suffer for a little while, it's going to be great. Right? To where, like the whole book, like chapter 1 through 5, it's been the same message. Suffer for a little while, eternal glory. Suffer for a little while, eternal glory. And then now that he's wrapping it up, he's beginning to prepare them to, okay, I've prepared you for the suffering. Now let's talk about the glory. Right? And so, like, he's not leaving on like a negative note. Right? He's not just like, hey guys, suck it up and suffer. Goodbye. Like, no. He's like, guys, it's going to be bad, but here's what we're waiting for. After you have suffered for a little while, after the last tear falls, the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ. But just think about it's amazing, right? Like, you don't even have to explain what he means by all grace there because of what he says next. Who calls you to his eternal glory in Christ. This is God calling us to eternal glory. He will himself, not somebody else, he's not going to send his angels to do it. He himself will restore you, strengthen you, confirm you, ground you. Like, that's amazing. No wonder he says, to him be might forever and ever. Like this is like a triumphal end to where it's like, it makes the suffering worth it. Right? Makes me think of the Phil Wickham song, Hymn of Heaven. Right? In the end, we'll see that it was worth it.
Oh yeah.
Like that's what it's going to be. So like whenever we talk about heaven, people have so many different weird views of it. But I think that's probably the most attractive aspect of heaven to me. The idea that, like, it's not that we're going to understand everything, right? Because there's nothing that suggests to us that, like, we're going to have omniscience in heaven, right? We're still going to learn, we're still going to grow. That's great. The thing that I find most attractive about heaven, other than just being in the presence of God himself, is that at long last, we'll see that it was worth it. You know, it's like, and we haven't even suffered that much, right? It's going to be even greater for the people who have suffered tremendously. But even for us, right? We'll realize that every tear that we shed, every heart that was broken, every hug we had to give somebody who was just going through something crazy, every death of a loved one we experienced, all of it will be worth it on that day. And right now we can't even fathom that because we understand the pain of it and we're like, how? But that's the promise, right? In the end, it will be worth it, right? All we have to do is right now suffer for a little while, right? These few years that we have on earth. It seems like a lot to us, but it's nothing compared to eternal glory. So just suffer for a little while. And then God, he's going to do what he promised. It's cool. Gotta start crying. I'll spare y'all.
Sometimes it's good to have to cry. Oh, for a bit.
Also in verse 10, I guess kind of like verse 6, depending on whether you see it as being ambiguous or as it being more like precisely in mind of like the future or now. Like between verses like 8 and 10. The other way I can also read this is that when he's saying you have suffered for a little while, it's also just kind of the idea that God is not going to like leave you, and that like he's not going to leave you necessarily like in a state of suffering for longer than necessary, if that makes sense. So it might feel like in that moment or that time period that you're in that situation for a long time, but ultimately he's not, I guess he is asking a lot of us, or a lot of them, but in the end it's for a very short time period. I don't know if that makes sense, but
Yeah. In the grand scheme of things, it's not as long as we deserve.
like I think we actually technically touched on this when we were going through James, but like to me, like the imagery of the lion too, it's like because we have like especially knowing that God is in complete control. There's also not, you don't have to necessarily worry, because even if you face a lion that is perfectly capable of mauling you, you know that he's always there to step in and take you out after like when necessary. And so he like, I'm trying to think what's the way that Paul words it in like, is it 2 Corinthians, where he's like, we are.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. I'll
Oh,
find
yeah.
it.
I mean, I don't know if that's actually relevant to this or not, but
Not abandoned.
Yeah.
2 Corinthians 4. Let's see.
Are you trying to say like he tries to crush us, but we're not abandoned? Like in general.
In
Yeah.
every way afflicted but not crushed, perplexed but not despairing, persecuted but not forsaken, struck down but not destroyed, always carrying about in the body the dying of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our body. Is that what you're going for?
that's what I was going for. I was trying to think if that's relevant or
2
not,
Corinthians 4.
That's so good.
because I don't know the full context of that, but just the idea that like, again, resist, like because I mean technically he is saying to resist a lion, which is typically not a very
Pleasant experience.
not very pleasant, and also I mean without God that would be a dumb thing to do, because you would die. But
Yeah.
like well
You
just
would die.
I mean just but like in the context of the letter, you know, like you really like you have to like humble yourself under the mighty hand of God, because I mean you won't be able to do that on your own. Like God will allow you to go through it, but at the same time he is the one who gets you out of it.
Yeah.
Like you can't really do it on your own per se. But anyways, just to go back to verse 10, I'm just basically saying that another way you could look at it, if it's a more broad, short term, is that in the context of, you know, going through hardship, is that God is not going to leave you there. He himself will, especially when he says who called you to his eternal glory in Christ. It be contrasted with the temporary hardship, right? So he himself will restore, strengthen, confirm, and ground you, and so he will like not let you be moved, so to speak. I think that was even imagery in the psalm that we talked about earlier.
Maybe the universal thing that unifies the church is that since Christ suffered in the flesh, that he went through so much in the physical, that asking people to follow after that and pick up their cross is actually reasonable. It's a reasonable service, because God has done so much for you. Like, it makes sense for you to want to follow after that and actually be willing to do so much more.
And also because he did that for us and we didn't deserve it. Now he's asking us to do it for him, and he does deserve it. And he deserves it even more because he did it for us when we didn't deserve it. Like, and so,
That's true.
yeah, it's reasonable.
Yeah.
You're willing to follow the master.
And just if you're following like some of the imagery, like he says to resist him firm in the faith, and then he says that he will restore, strengthen, confirm, and ground you. Just in the big picture of if we've been talking about your faith being tested in ways that exposes your heart, that leads to like when followed with repentance and obedience, it strengthens you. Like just as far as like what these words are specifically thinking of, like, you know, the restore is like him actually bringing you out, like bringing you up out of the situation, strengthening. So this would be, you know, you're strengthened once you come back from this hardship that actually reveals your heart and kind of gives you direction, and then confirms when he kind of shows you that like this is what you needed to go through, and then in the end that actually will he'll ground you, so he'll it'll further it'll keep you firmer in the faith, so to speak. I don't know if that makes sense.
And also by revealing the faith, it shows that you have what Jesus has given you, like what He has, He gives you, and that's what's revealed is your faith. Like faith is a gift. Like if you're tried, that's how you reveal faith, is by being tested.
That's true. Yeah. Anything else there for verse 10? All right, last verse. To Him be might forever and ever. Amen.
Well, it's good that Peter also doesn't put the glory on himself.
He's the might.
I mean, that's also an example of being humble too.
Well, I was going to say it seems to tie back to that because at the beginning of this paragraph he says, under the mighty hand of God, right? And the context is, stop trying to make yourself so mighty, let God be mighty.
Yeah.
And then he spends the whole time explaining how literally we can't accomplish anything without God. Like the devil's a lion, he's ready to devour us. We're screwed without God. So if you think that you're mighty, let's see you take on the devil for 30 seconds. Let's see it happen. Let's see you resist him for 30 seconds without God. You won't win, right? You'll be devoured, right? And so if you think you're mighty, well, get ready to be humiliated because you're going to be devoured like that. However, if you endure and if you trust in God, He's going to do all this stuff for you. And so He's like, yeah, let's let Him be the one who stays mighty forever and ever. And let's just humble ourselves, right? Let's leave the might to the one who deserves it, right? I just like it's such a beautiful idea. Not one that's going to get through to our heads because we're stubborn and sinful. We're just going to be like, no, I'm different. I deserve it. It's like, okay.
Yeah, right.
In actuality, we don't deserve anything.
I also always like when the Bible says forever and ever, because for me that applies eternity in heaven. And I think if God is good, if God is mighty, I mean you can display a little bit of that now, but that'll be forever. Once it's revealed that there's eternity of God being mighty.
Mm-hmm. Anything else there for the last verse?
Unless you want to start singing.
Right. Say good stuff.
Starts weeping. Is He worthy?
He is worthy.
Right.
Is He worthy?
He is worthy.
For 1 hour straight.
Yeah.
All right. Well, any last thoughts over just the whole section before we close out?
I know we're not done with the book yet. We still have a few more verses, right? We only have what?
3
verses? Oh man, we better finish next week. If we don't finish next week, we got an issue. But I just want to say thank you, Sean, for leading us through this book.
Yeah, of course.
I've enjoyed it.
It's been good.
A lot.
It's been a good how many months now?
It's been a long time.
But I mean, we'll speed up the process. When we get to 2 Kings, we'll go faster. But I think it's been good to I don't know. We spend so much time covering a lot of scripture that I think it's good to show us just how much you can get out of it. I mean, there's even stuff that we didn't even cover. But I don't know. I think it's a good discussion. So I just want to say thank you.
Who's Peter's contemporary? Paul? Who else is there? What other church leaders are there?
At this time, we don't know.
We don't know who's dead or who's alive.
Isn't Peter a church leader?
He is, but we just we don't really know a lot of the stuff about the church at this time period outside of the New Testament
Oh.
because they were too busy, dying to make a lot of historical records.
So I'm assuming it's the disciples, but we really don't know anything extra.
Yeah.
What you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
I guess we could probably assume that they all probably had their own disciples, but we just don't know who they are.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Alrighty. Well, if there's nothing else, then I guess can someone pray us out?
I'll do it. Lord, we praise you for your word. And as we went through it tonight, God, I pray that every single one of us will be convicted by it. And as we depart from here tonight, God, or even as we spend a little bit of time here together afterwards, I pray that you will help us be sober-minded and be watchful and be prepared. Because even though this book is coming to a close and we're going to soon move on to study other scriptures and probably be going a little faster through it, I don't want us to forget the things that we covered here, right? We spent several months going through these 5 chapters, God. Let those not be wasted months, but rather let our hearts be transformed, and may we be part of the solution that this world and that our churches need. In a world and in a culture that just doesn't serve you as we should, and who isn't faithful to you like we should, help us be the exception, God. Let us be the ones who break the cycle. Not because we're seeking persecution, God, but simply because we're seeking your glory. Help us seek that above all else, and let that be the primary thing that matters to us. Not to where we become like big jerk Christians who are just being mean to people in the name of the glory of God, but instead people who are seeking to love others and love you for your glory. Not so that we can prove ourselves mighty, but so that we can prove that you deserve the might forever and ever. We love you, Lord. In your name we pray. Amen.